When I asked my wife for $500 to fix our leaking roof, she laughed and told me to get a job. That laugh echoed through our house like a slap across my face, reverberating off the walls I'd painted myself, bouncing off the floors I'd laid with my own bleeding hands. My name's David Carter, and that laugh, that cold, dismissive laugh, cost her everything she thought she owned. Everything she thought made her better than me. Everything she thought gave her the right to look down on the man who'd spent 23 years of his life running toward danger while everyone else ran away. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really began, to the slow burn of humiliation that had been eating away at my soul for years. 23 years I've been an EMT in this city. 23 years of pulling people from twisted metal, of breathing life back into children's lungs, of holding dying hands in the back of ambulances racing through traffic lights that might as well have been prayers. 23 years of coming home with other people's blood under my fingernails and their last words echoing in my ears. You want to know what 23 years of saving lives pays? $42,000 a year. Before taxes. Before the union dues. Before the mandatory overtime that comes when someone calls in sick and there's no one else to cover. $42,000 to watch people take their last breaths and to sometimes, just sometimes, convince them to take another one. But Melissa, my wife of 15 years, she stopped seeing the nobility in that work a long time ago. She stopped seeing me as someone who mattered. Somewhere along the way, she decided that a man's worth was measured by the zeros in his bank account, not by the lives he'd saved or the difference he'd made. She quit her teaching job 8 years ago, said she was exploring her potential, and turned into something I didn't recognize. Something that spent more on handbags than I made in a month. Something that introduced me to her friends as David, he works in emergency response, never saying the word EMT, like it was some kind of disease she might catch. I drive a 2008 Toyota Camry with 230,000 miles on it. The paint is faded, the seats are worn thin, and sometimes it takes 3 tries to get it started on cold mornings. But it runs, and it gets me to work, and it's paid for. That car has carried me to more emergency calls than I can count. It's been my sanctuary after the worst shifts, the place where I've cried after losing patients I couldn't save. But to Melissa, it was an embarrassment. A symbol of my failure to level up in life. The house we live in, the house I bought before I met her, the house I've maintained and repaired with my own hands for 15 years, it's modest. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a small yard where I used to grow tomatoes before she decided vegetables were too suburban. The mortgage is almost paid off, something I'm proud of, something that represents security and stability. But to Melissa, it's a prison. Too small, too ordinary, too beneath the lifestyle she thinks she deserves. And the humiliations. God, the humiliations. They started small, almost innocent. A comment here and there about my little job or my cute uniform. But they grew. They festered. They became weapons she used to cut me down piece by piece until I started to believe maybe she was right. Maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe I never would be. I remember the dinner party at her friend Rachel's house. Rachel married a real estate developer, lives in one of those McMansions with the circular driveway and the fountain in the front yard. Melissa had been talking about me before I arrived. I could tell by the way the conversation stopped when I walked into the room, by the pitying looks the other wives gave me, by the way the men suddenly found their drinks fascinating. So David, Rachel's husband Brad said, swirling his whiskey like he was conducting an orchestra, Melissa tells us you're in the medical field. Before I could answer, Melissa jumped in. Oh, David's practically volunteering for peanuts. You know how it is with public service, all heart, no money. She laughed, and the others laughed with her, and I stood there in my one good shirt feeling like I was shrinking into the expensive carpet beneath my feet. EMT, I said quietly. I'm an EMT. Oh, Brad said, and I watched his interest die in real time. That's really important work. The kind of important that means, I'm glad someone does it so I don't have to think about it. The kind of important that gets you a pat on the head and forgotten the moment the conversation moves on to real topics. Topics like property investments and vacation homes, and which private school has the best lacrosse program. But the worst part wasn't Brad's dismissal. It was watching my wife nod along, agreeing with the assessment that what I did for a living was somehow less than what these people did. These people who'd never held a dying child. These people who'd never performed CPR on a teenager who overdosed in a gas station bathroom. These people who measured their worth in stock portfolios and social media followers. The humiliations came in waves after that. At the grocery store, she'd make comments about having to budget because of my salary, loud enough for other customers to hear. At her book club meetings, she'd complain about being financially limited by my career choices. She started declining invitations to events where she'd have to bring me, claiming she was going solo to network. And then came the night shifts. The endless, soul-crushing night shifts where I'd see the worst of humanity and somehow still find the strength to fight for their lives. I'd come home at 7 in the morning, exhausted, haunted by whatever I'd seen, and she'd be getting ready for another day of, what? Shopping? Lunch with friends? Whatever it was that filled her days while I was out there watching people die. You look tired, she'd say, not looking up from her phone. Maybe you should Or, she said, not looking up from her phone, scrolling through whatever social media feed was more important than our conversation, you could learn some responsibility and figure out how to make more money like everyone else. Everyone else. Like the husbands of her friends who worked in air-conditioned offices, who'd never held someone's life in their hands, who'd never had to tell a mother that her son didn't make it. Everyone else who apparently had their priorities straight while I was out there wasting my time saving lives for $42,000 a year. I fixed the roof myself. Spent my day off climbing up there with a bucket of sealant and some spare shingles I bought with money from my emergency fund. The fund I'd been building for years, $20 here, $50 there, money saved from skipping lunch or doing oil changes myself instead of taking the car to a shop. Money that should have been for emergencies, not for basic home maintenance because my wife thought $500 was too much to spend on keeping our house from falling apart. But here's what she didn't know. Here's what nobody knew. 3 months before I asked her for that $500, 3 months before she laughed at me and told me to get a real job, I bought a lottery ticket at the gas station where I always fill up the Camry. One ticket, $2, numbers I picked because they meant something to me, my badge number, the date I started as an EMT, my mother's birthday. $5.2 million. That's what those numbers were worth. $5.2 million sitting in an account she didn't know existed, managed by lawyers she'd never met, protected by trusts she couldn't touch. $5.2 million that could have fixed every roof in our neighborhood, could have bought her all the designer handbags and fancy dinners and status symbols she'd ever wanted. But I didn't tell her. I didn't tell anyone. Because sometimes silence tells you more than words ever could, and I needed to know who would love me when the bank account was empty and who would only love me when it was full. I needed to know if the woman I'd married 15 years ago still existed somewhere underneath the designer clothes and the social climbing and the endless pursuit of appearances. So I kept working. Kept driving the Camry. Kept wearing the same uniform, kept running the same calls, kept saving the same lives for the same $42,000 a year. And I watched. I watched to see if she'd remember why she fell in love with me in the first place. I watched to see if she'd remember that I was the same man who held her when her father died, who worked double shifts to pay for her mother's cancer treatments, who'd given her 15 years of faithfulness and dedication and love. She didn't remember. Or maybe she remembered and just didn't care anymore. Maybe the man she'd fallen in love with wasn't enough anymore. Maybe she needed more than someone who would die for her. Maybe she needed someone who could buy her the life she thought she deserved. The storm hit in April. A real storm, the kind that knocks out power lines and floods basements and reminds you how small you are in the face of nature's fury. I was working that night, of course. Storms mean accidents. Accidents mean emergency calls. Emergency calls mean EMTs like me racing through the rain and wind to pull people out of situations they never should have been in. I came home at 6 in the morning to find water pouring through our bedroom ceiling. The patch job I'd done wasn't enough for a storm that fierce. Water was dripping onto our bed, soaking into the hardwood floors, spreading across the ceiling like a cancer. And there was Melissa, standing in the middle of it all, staring at the water damage to her designer rug. The rug that cost more than I made in a month. The rug that was now soaked and ruined and worthless. "Look what you've done," she said, not looking at me, not acknowledging that I just spent 12 hours in the rain pulling people from car accidents and house fires. "Look what your cheap fix has done to my things." My cheap fix. My attempt to solve the problem she wouldn't let me fix properly. My $500 solution that became a $5,000 disaster because she thought I wasn't worth the investment. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. Not because it was my fault, storms like that would have found any weakness in any roof, but because I was sorry for what we'd become. Sorry for the woman standing in front of me who cared more about a rug than about the man who just spent the night saving lives. Sorry for the marriage that had died so slowly I hadn't even noticed it was gone. "Sorry doesn't fix my rug," she said. "Sorry doesn't undo the damage. Maybe next time you'll listen when I tell you to get a real job and fix things properly." That's when I knew. Standing there in our ruined bedroom, water dripping on my head like a baptism, I knew that love without respect isn't love at all. It's something else. Something poisonous. Something that eats away at your soul until you forget who you are and why you matter. That morning, after she went to stay at her sister's house to escape the disaster zone I'd created, I made some phone calls. First to the law firm that had been handling my lottery winnings. Then to the financial advisor who'd been helping me structure the trusts and investments. Then to a real estate agent who specialized in downtown apartments. Small places. Quiet places. Places where a man could start over without anyone asking him to justify his worth. The lawyers were efficient. Cold, maybe, but efficient. They explained the prenuptial agreement Melissa had insisted on before we got married. How it protected her teaching pension but also limited her claims on any assets I'd acquired independently. Assets like lottery winnings that predated our current marital troubles. Assets that could be moved and protected and distributed according to my wishes, not hers. The financial advisor was more sympathetic. He'd worked with other men going through divorces, other men who discovered that their wives loved their potential more than their reality. He helped me set up charitable trusts, educational funds for the children of fallen first responders, scholarship programs for kids who wanted to become EMTs but couldn't afford the training. $5.2 million could do a lot of good in the right hands. In hands that understood the value of service over status. The real estate agent found me a one-bedroom apartment 6 blocks from the hospital. Nothing fancy, but clean and quiet and mine. A place where I could watch the sunrise without someone telling me I wasn't enough. A place where I could eat dinner without listening to complaints about my paycheck or my car or my lack of ambition. A place where I could be proud of what I did for a living instead of apologizing for it. But I wasn't ready to move yet. I had one more thing to do first. One more test to run. One more chance to see if the woman I'd married was still in there somewhere, buried under the disappointment and the status-seeking and the endless pursuit of more. Melissa's 40th birthday was coming up in May. She'd been planning it for months, not just a party, but a charity gala. Women of Success supporting emergency services. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was going to raise money for people like me while telling anyone who would listen that her own husband wasn't successful enough for her standards. She'd rented the ballroom at the Marriott downtown. Hired a catering company, a photographer, a DJ. Sent out invitations to every influential woman in the city, every wife of every successful businessman, every social media influencer who might boost her profile. She was going to auction off donated items and experiences, with all proceeds going to the local EMT foundation. All proceeds. That's what the invitation said. All proceeds from an event celebrating women who supported emergency services, organized by a woman who mocked her EMT husband for not making enough money. I decided that would be the perfect place to make my announcement. The perfect place to show everyone, including my wife, what real generosity looked like. What it meant to support emergency services when you actually had the means to make a difference. The gala was everything Melissa had dreamed it would be. The ballroom was decorated in gold and silver, with spotlights and flower arrangements that probably cost more than most people made in a week. She wore a new dress for the occasion, black silk, designer label, the kind of dress that whispered money without having to say it out loud. She looked beautiful, I'll give her that. She always looked beautiful when she was in her element, surrounded by the kind of people she wanted to be. I wore my only good suit. Navy blue, 5 years old, bought for my nephew's wedding and worn maybe 6 times since then. I'd had it dry cleaned, made sure my shoes were polished, even bought a new tie for the occasion. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to look respectable when I stood up and changed everything. The auction started after dinner. Melissa was in her glory, working the room like a seasoned politician, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, complimenting women she'd criticized behind their backs, playing the role of the perfect hostess. She introduced each auction item with practiced enthusiasm, talking about the importance of supporting our brave first responders, the heroes who risk their lives for our safety. Heroes. She called us heroes while living with one and treating him like a disappointment. The bid started small. A weekend at a lake house went for $800. A spa package for $1,200. A dinner for 6 at an exclusive restaurant for $2,000. Respectable amounts, the kind of money these women could spend without thinking about it, the kind of money that would make a difference to the EMT Foundation even if it wasn't life-changing. But then came the big item. A luxury cruise package, 7 days in the Caribbean, donated by one of the travel agencies owned by someone's husband. The bidding was more competitive for this one. $1,500. $2,000. $3,000. The energy in the room picked up. Women who'd been checking their phones started paying attention. This was the kind of item that would define the success of the evening. $4,000. $5,000. The bidding slowed down as the amounts got serious. These women might have money, but they weren't going to throw it away, even for charity. Even for the heroes they were supposedly supporting. $6,000, called out Patricia Morrison, wife of a city councilman, clearly determined to win the package and the social credit that came with it. $7,000, countered Jennifer Walsh, whose husband owned half the restaurants in the downtown district. The auctioneer looked around the room. $7,000. Do I hear 8? This is for our brave emergency responders, ladies. Do I hear 8,000? Silence. 7,000 was apparently the limit for their charitable impulses. 7,000 was what they thought the heroes were worth. I stood up from my table in the back of the room. Every head turned to look at me, this unremarkable man in an unremarkable suit who'd been so quiet all evening that most people had forgotten I was there. $2 million, I said. The silence that followed was absolute. Not just quiet, absolute silence, like the moment after a gunshot when the world holds its breath. The auctioneer blinked. Someone's wine glass slipped from nerveless fingers and shattered on the floor. Melissa's face went white, then red, then white again. "Sir," the auctioneer said, his voice carefully controlled, "did you say $2 million?" "I did," I said, my voice carrying in the silent ballroom. $2 million for the cruise package. For our brave emergency responders. The whispers started then. Confused murmurs, shocked gasps, the kind of excited chatter that erupts when something impossible happens in front of people who thought they'd seen everything. Phones came out. Pictures were taken. Social media posts were typed with shaking fingers. Melissa pushed through the crowd toward me, her face a mask of confusion and growing panic. "David," she hissed when she reached me, "what are you doing? What is this? We don't have $2 million. We don't have $2,000. Don't we?" I asked, looking into her eyes, looking for any sign of the woman I'd married, any hint that she might understand what was happening and why. The auctioneer had recovered his composure. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a bid of $2 million from." He looked at me expectantly. "David Carter," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "EMT with the city fire department for 23 years. And husband to your lovely hostess." The murmurs got louder. More phones came out. This was the kind of story that would be all over social media within minutes. The humble EMT who somehow had $2 million to spend on charity. The mystery man married to Melissa Carter who'd been organizing charity events while her own husband was secretly wealthy. But they had it wrong. I wasn't secretly wealthy. I was publicly humiliated, and I was about to make sure everyone knew it. The auctioneer gavelled the sale closed. $2 million for a 7-day cruise that was worth maybe $10,000. The room erupted in applause, but I could see the confusion in their faces. They didn't understand how this was possible. They didn't understand what they were witnessing. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, and the room fell quiet again. "Could I have everyone's attention for just a moment?" Melissa grabbed my arm. "David, stop. Please. Whatever this is, just stop." But I couldn't stop. Not after 15 years of being told I wasn't enough. Not after watching her choose status over love, appearance over substance, money over the man who would have died for her. "My name is David Carter," I said, walking toward the small stage at the front of the ballroom. "I've been an EMT in this city for 23 years. I make $42,000 a year saving lives. My wife, the beautiful woman who organized this wonderful event, has spent the last several years encouraging me to get a real job. To find something more profitable." The room was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Uncomfortable. Charged. People could sense that something important was happening, something that would be talked about for years. 3 months ago, I continued, I won $5.2 million in the state lottery. I didn't tell anyone. Not my wife, not my friends, not my family. I wanted to see who would love me for who I am, not for what I have. I wanted to test whether the woman I married still existed, or whether she'd been replaced by someone who measures a man's worth by his bank account. Gasps. Real gasps this time, not the polite surprise of society women but the shocked inhalation of people who suddenly understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Last month," I said, my voice getting stronger, my pain transforming into something harder, something sharper, I asked my wife for $500 to fix our leaking roof. She laughed at me. Told me to get a real job. Said I needed to learn responsibility. I looked out at the crowd, at all these successful women who'd been sympathizing with Melissa about her disappointing husband, who'd been nodding along when she complained about my lack of ambition. "That roof collapsed during last month's storm," I said. "Water damage cost us $5,000. But the real damage was already done. The damage to a marriage where love was conditional on income. Where 23 years of service meant nothing because the pay wasn't impressive enough. Melissa was crying now, standing frozen in the middle of the ballroom while everyone stared at her, while the foundation of her social identity crumbled in real time. The woman who'd built her reputation on being married to a disappointment was learning that her disappointment was worth more than anyone in that room. So tonight, I said, I'm making good on the promise of this event. Supporting our emergency responders. This $2 million donation will go directly to the families of fallen EMTs, paramedics, and firefighters. It will fund college scholarships for their children, support programs for their widows, and maybe, just maybe, remind people that the worth of a person isn't measured by the size of their paycheck. The applause started slowly, uncertainly, then built into something overwhelming. But I wasn't finished. I had more to say, more pain to release, more truth to tell. My wife introduced me tonight as her husband, I said when the applause died down. But she's been introducing me to her friends as David. He works in emergency response, 4 years now. Never EMT. Never paramedic. Never the man who's held dying children in his arms or performed CPR on teenagers who overdosed in gas station bathrooms. Just, emergency response. Like I was something to be ashamed of. The room was completely silent now. This had gone beyond entertainment, beyond social media content. This was a marriage ending in public, a relationship dissected in front of 200 witnesses. I've saved 47 lives in my career, I said, my voice breaking slightly on the number. 47 people who went home to their families because I was there, because I knew what to do, because I cared enough to run toward danger instead of away from it. But that wasn't enough for the woman standing behind me. That wasn't success. That wasn't worth respecting. I turned to look at Melissa, who was still standing in the middle of the crowd, mascara running down her cheeks, her perfect evening destroyed by the revelation that her disappointing husband was worth more than she'd ever imagined. Money doesn't change who you are, I said, looking directly at her. It just reveals who you've always been. Tonight, I revealed that I'm someone who values service over status, substance over appearance. Someone who thinks saving lives is more important than impressing friends. Someone who would rather be respected for what I do than loved for what I have. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then someone started clapping. Slow, deliberate applause that was picked up by another person, then another, until the entire ballroom was applauding not for the donation but for the honesty, for the raw truth of what they'd just witnessed. But I wasn't done. I had one more thing to say, one more knife to twist in the wound that had been bleeding for years. The irony, I said, is that if she'd asked me for $2 million to fix that roof, I would have given it to her. If she'd asked me for $5 million to buy a bigger house, I would have written the check. If she'd asked me for anything at all with love instead of contempt, with respect instead of shame, I would have given her everything. I paused, letting that sink in, letting everyone in that room understand what had really been lost here. But she didn't ask with love. She asked with disgust. She didn't see a partner who could provide for her, she saw a failure who couldn't even come up with $500 to fix a roof. So instead of sharing this windfall with the woman I married, I'm sharing it with people who understand the value of service. People who know that real worth isn't measured in dollars. The applause started again, but I held up my hand to stop it. I had one more thing to say. Tomorrow morning, I'll be filing for divorce. The prenuptial agreement my wife insisted on will protect her teacher's pension, but it will also limit her claims on assets acquired independently during the marriage. Assets like lottery winnings. Assets like the $4.2 million that will remain after tonight's donation. The gasp that went through the room was audible. They were all doing the math, realizing that in the space of one evening, Melissa had gone from being married to a disappointment to being divorced from a millionaire. But more than that, I said, I'll be going back to work on Monday morning. Same job, same uniform, same commitment to saving lives. Because that's who I am. That's who I've always been. And no amount of money will ever change that. I walked off the stage then, through the silent crowd, past my crying wife, past the shocked faces and raised phones and dropped jaws. I walked out of that ballroom and into the parking lot where my 2008 Toyota Camry was waiting for me, reliable and humble and honest in a way that nothing else in my life had been for a very long time. The story broke on social media before I even got home. Humble EMT reveals $5 million lottery win at wife's charity gala. Secret millionaire donates $2 million after wife mocks his job. The most expensive divorce announcement ever. The hashtags were trending within hours. Hashtag EMT millionaire, hashtag humble hero, hashtag respect first responders. But the real story wasn't about the money. The real story was about what happened when someone you love stops seeing your worth. When service becomes shameful and dedication becomes disappointment. When the person who's supposed to have your back starts stabbing you in it instead. The divorce papers were filed the next Monday, just like I said they would be. Clean, simple, citing irreconcilable differences. The prenup held up exactly the way the lawyers said it would. Melissa got her teacher's pension, her car, and half the house. I got my lottery winnings, my pension, and my freedom. The media attention was intense for about a week. Local news stations wanted interviews. National morning shows called. Social media influencers tried to get me to tell my story on their platforms. But I turned them all down. This wasn't about fame or attention. This was about dignity. About standing up for everyone who's ever been told their service doesn't matter because it doesn't pay enough. The foundation loved the donation, obviously. $2 million was more than they typically raised in 5 years. They used it to establish a permanent endowment for the families of fallen first responders, exactly like I'd promised. They named it the David Carter Emergency Services Family Fund, but I asked them to change it to something less personal. This wasn't about me. It was about making sure that other EMTs, other paramedics, other firefighters would never have to choose between feeding their families and serving their communities. Melissa's world collapsed pretty quickly after that. The video of my speech went viral, which meant her treatment of me became public knowledge. The women who'd been her friends suddenly remembered other commitments when she called. The influencer partnerships dried up when brands realized she was associated with a story about marital cruelty. The charity organization stopped calling her to volunteer. Her sister posted a long Facebook rant about how I'd humiliated a good woman and destroyed a marriage for revenge, but the comments section told a different story. Hundreds of first responders and their families sharing their own experiences with people who didn't value their service. Teachers and nurses and social workers talking about being told to get real jobs by people who'd never saved a life or changed one. The house we'd shared for 15 years went up for sale 3 months after the divorce was finalized. Too big for one person, too expensive for a teacher's salary, too full of memories of a marriage that had died long before I won the lottery. She moved into a small apartment across town, got a job teaching again, started rebuilding a life that didn't depend on other people's money or status. I heard through mutual friends that she was struggling, financially and emotionally. Part of me felt bad about that. The part that had loved her for 15 years, that remembered the woman who used to be proud of what I did for a living, who used to brag to her friends about being married to someone who saved lives. But a bigger part of me felt relieved. Relieved that I'd finally stood up for myself. Relieved that I'd stopped accepting treatment that no human being should have to accept. Relieved that I'd proven to myself and everyone else that dignity matters more than money, that respect matters more than wealth, that love without honor isn't really love at all. 6 months after the gala, I got a letter in the mail. Handwritten, on simple stationery, addressed to my new apartment downtown. It was from Melissa. "David," it said, "I've had a lot of time to think about what happened between us, about what I became and why. You were right about everything. I did stop seeing your worth. I did measure you by your paycheck instead of your character. I did treat you like a disappointment when you were actually the best man I've ever known. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a second chance. I just wanted you to know that losing you taught me what real value is. Not the value of money or status or impressing people who don't really matter, but the value of dedication and service and unconditional love. I'm teaching again. 4th grade. I tell my students about heroes every day, about EMTs and firefighters and police officers and all the people who risk their lives to keep us safe. I tell them that real success isn't about how much money you make, but about how much good you do in the world. I'm sorry it took losing everything to learn what I should have known all along. You deserved better than what I gave you. The community deserves better than what I was giving them. I'm trying to be better now, but I know it's too late for us. I hope you're happy. I hope you're still saving lives and still proud of what you do. I hope someday you can forgive me, not for my sake but for yours, because you're too good a man to carry hatred in your heart. Love always. Melissa. I read that letter 3 times before I folded it up and put it in the drawer with all the other pieces of my past that I wasn't ready to throw away but wasn't ready to face either. Forgiveness is complicated when the person who hurt you actually understands what they did wrong. It's easier to hate someone who never gets it than to forgive someone who gets it too late. But she was right about one thing: I am too good a man to carry hatred in my heart. Or maybe I'm just too tired to keep being angry about something that can't be changed. Either way, the letter helped me understand that what happened between us wasn't entirely her fault. We both got lost somewhere along the way. We both forgot what really mattered. The difference is that I found my way back to who I really am, while she's still trying to figure out who she wants to be. A year later, I'm still working as an EMT. Still driving the same calls, still saving the same lives, still making the same salary. The only difference is that now I don't go home to someone who makes me feel ashamed of what I do. I go home to a quiet apartment where I can read books about medicine and history and philosophy without being interrupted by complaints about my lack of ambition. The money is still there, invested conservatively, growing slowly, waiting for the right opportunities to do good. I've made a few more donations: a new ambulance for the county, scholarship funds for medical students, a pediatric wing at the local hospital named after a child I couldn't save 5 years ago. But mostly I just live like I always have, modestly and quietly and with purpose. People recognize me sometimes. The story made enough of an impact that EMTs and paramedics from other cities have reached out to share their own experiences with being undervalued and disrespected. I've gotten letters from first responder spouses thanking me for standing up for them, for proving that their husbands and wives matter, that what they do is important even if it doesn't make them rich. That's what this was really about. Not revenge, though I understand why people see it that way. Not money, though that's what made the statement possible. It was about dignity. About standing up and saying that some things matter more than profit, that some work is valuable even when it's not highly paid, that some people deserve respect for what they give rather than judgment for what they lack. Money can expose character faster than it can change it. That's what I learned from all this. Having $5 million didn't make me a different person, it just gave me the resources to show who I really was. And discovering that her husband was wealthy didn't make Melissa a different person either, it just revealed who she'd become. The real tragedy isn't that she missed out on being rich. The real tragedy is that she missed out on being married to someone who would have shared everything with her if she just loved him for who he was instead of resenting him for who he wasn't. But that's her tragedy, not mine. My tragedy was thinking I had to earn love through financial success instead of deserving it through character and dedication. My tragedy was accepting less respect than I deserved because I thought that was all I was worth. I know better now. I know that saving lives is success, whether it pays $40,000 a year or $4 million. I know that running toward danger when everyone else runs away is heroic, whether anyone appreciates it or not. I know that dedication and service and compassion are worth more than stock portfolios and designer clothes and social media followers. And I know that respect isn't something you can buy or earn or beg for. It's something you give and receive freely, or you don't give and receive it at all. Love without respect isn't love, it's something uglier, something that eats away at both people until nothing good is left. Where are you watching from? Because if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been told your work doesn't matter because it doesn't pay enough, if you've ever been made to feel ashamed of dedicating your life to something bigger than yourself, then this story is for you. You matter. What you do matters. The lives you save, the differences you make, the sacrifices you accept in service of others, all of that matters more than any bank account or status symbol or social media post. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't let anyone make you feel small for choosing to be great in ways that can't be measured in dollars. Respect the ones who stand by you when the balance is low, because they're the real fortune. And remember that dignity never goes out of style, never loses its value, never fails to matter in the end. That's what I learned in that ballroom, standing in front of 200 people who'd forgotten what real success looks like. That's what I want you to remember long after this story ends. Because your worth isn't determined by your wealth, it's determined by your character, your service, your willingness to stand up for what matters even when it costs you everything. Even when it costs you everything, dignity is worth the price. Every single time.